very great people exercise an influence beyond their generation. And cities like this one are an ideal platform.
Methodist Central Hall in Westminster, London, was the setting of the inaugural meeting of the United Nations just after World War II. The influence of the person we're speaking about goes back to the 18th century and has reached millions of people the world over. But we don't begin here at the heart of London. We begin in a town in the north of England. John Wesley was born here on the 17th of June, 1703. He became a man of great influence, not only in his own day, but in the story of the world. And that influence can be seen in the realm of education, social justice, and religion.
Following his time at Charterhouse School in London, John Wesley went up to Oxford. In 1720, he entered Christ Church, the largest college in the university, as an undergraduate. John Wesley's life here in Oxford was very full. He played billiards, backgammon, tennis, went dancing. In fact, he did many things that later Methodists would have frowned upon. It's also important to acknowledge that he took his studies very seriously indeed, and the makings of a scholar are not too difficult to discern.
Well, I think the fact he came from a scholarly home was a big help, really, and I think Charterhouse had done a wonderful job before he actually came. But I think what Oxford taught him, perhaps what Oxford's tried to teach its students all through the centuries, is to read and write and think for themselves, to present an argument and to defend an argument, but also to have sympathy with people who have a different point of view.
It was while John was at Oxford that his father Samuel encouraged him into a life of Christian service. In 1724, he graduated from Oxford and was ordained a deacon the following year. Here in Christ Church Cathedral, John was ordained a priest of the Church of England in 1728. So, with an Oxford education and the religious influence of his parents, he returned to Epworth.
Later that year, he and Charles would board the Simmons and set off for America. Leaving England's coastline, John would have mixed emotions. He was chosen by the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and set sail from Gravesend in October 1735. He was looking forward to the challenges ahead in the newest British colony, and he had ideas of converting those he described as Native Americans. But John was also reconciling his own faith and still coming to terms with the death of his father. He who went to help others was still far from sorted in his own life.
John's experience on May the 24th in 1738 added a new urgency to his preaching and work. He now had the diligence of his disciplined lifestyle and was driven by a message that he offered to all. When he thought through his mission and purpose after returning from that time in Germany, he wrote, "I look upon all the world as my parish, and this is the work I know God has called me to." Pulpits began to close to John Wesley, and yet he remained firmly convinced that a church was the only decent place for religion. That was until another significant change occurred. George Whitefield, a friend from Oxford days, invited John to preach outside of a church in the open air, which was soon to become known as field preaching. It was here in 1739 that John Wesley began to see the full impact of field preaching firsthand. George Whitefield was receiving a warm welcome in many towns and villages through his preaching outside of churches. But for John, the decision to embrace this style did not come easily. John Wesley's reputation would go before him. He was often welcomed with generous hospitality, but this was not always the case. When he stopped to preach, he spoke intently and with purpose. Not everyone was appreciative of him, his practices, or his evangelical fervour. His life was often threatened by the people who opposed his message, sometimes when he was riding alone on horseback, and on other occasions in front of a large crowd while he was preaching. But this did not stop John. He had a persuasive way with words and the ability to control a single aggressor and an angry mob. Before long, his influence spread to politics.
John Wesley's word about politics was that anybody from any party, from any part of society that can contribute to the well-being of that society, contribute to the common good of the people, can build people up, give them their dignity. He knew how to drop words of wisdom into the ears of those who had it in their power to change things. But secondly, he was definitely modeling good practice.
Throughout the 1750s, 60s and 70s, Methodism grew around the country at an appreciable rate. John's influence also grew, and he was able to do many things that still ripple into our world today. The natural growth of his work with the poor was turning his attention to social justice and seeking equality for all. John believed that all people are equal before God, and while he describes his experience in America as a failure, he did talk with slaves, and this made a deep impression upon him, and he supported the Society for the Suppression of the Slave Trade. Here is an original letter. It's a letter from William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was involved in the British parliamentary system in campaigning for the abolition of slavery. Now here's something remarkable. Here is a pen. It's a very simple pen, and yet it did something very important. This pen was the one that John Wesley used to write to William Wilberforce the very last letter he ever wrote. And it was to encourage Wilberforce to continue in the struggle against slavery. And eventually, slavery on the North Atlantic slave routes was abolished. His social and political influence rippled into North America, and the Wesleyan voice eventually contributed to better relationship between black and white, and the work went on in Africa.
There was a time when the leadership of the ANC, who finally became the liberation movement that brought us to freedom, were almost all products of Methodist mission education. Nelson Mandela is the product of a Methodist education.
John Wesley was a man who challenged the values of his day. And he's perhaps one of the most influential people who've ever lived. From simple beginnings to a dynamic worldwide movement, the social impact of John Wesley is quite remarkable. Though perhaps not always recognized, his influence is still felt today, hundreds of years after his death.